You stand in the quiet of Kensington Palace. February 9, 2002. The morning light is pale, filtered through half-drawn curtains that fail to keep the chill from settling on your skin. The air is heavy with the residue of smoke, decades of it, clinging to the velvet drapes, to the gilt frames, to her lungs. On the nightstand, a porcelain ashtray is crowded with lipstick-stained cigarette ends, tilted like wilted flowers over the rim of cold tea. A faint hum of an oxygen machine breaks the silence. It's a tired, rhythmic sound, a machine breathing for a woman who once refused to be controlled by anything or anyone. You take a step closer. The scent is part antiseptic, part perfume, Chanel No. 5 warring with hospital alcohol. On the bed lies a frail woman wrapped in white sheets, her once famous dark hair thinning, her eyes half closed but restless. Her fingers twitch, searching for a cigarette that no one will let her have. This is Princess Margaret, sister to Queen Elizabeth II, once the wild heart of the monarchy, the woman who danced with the Rolling Stones, drank until dawn, and scandalized an empire that demanded perfection. The same woman who now lies dying from the slow consequences of her rebellion: pneumonia, heart disease, strokes, the silent punishments of a life lived too quickly. The clock on the mantel ticks toward 10 in the morning. You can almost hear it echoing through the decades, a reminder that time has always been the one authority even a princess cannot defy. If you listen closely, the palace itself seems to remember the laughter from parties at Clarence House, the sound of heels on marble, the whispers of scandal that once filled every tabloid in London. But now there is only quiet, and you, standing in the room where royalty meets mortality. It's here, in this half-lit chamber, that the story begins, not of crowns and duties, but of a woman who wanted to live as herself in a world that forbade it. The story of how rebellion became confinement, and how glamour decayed into loneliness. As you listen, you may realize this is not merely about a princess. It's about the weight of expectation, the cost of desire, and the body's slow revenge against the life it's forced to carry. If you find meaning in histories like this, where power meets decay, and beauty meets truth, stay. Take a deep breath, and keep listening. Because what follows is not gossip. It's the anatomy of a royal death. You are not a tourist in time. You are a witness. You remember the smell first. It clings to her even in photographs: tobacco, gin, and Chanel No. 5, the scent of defiance bottled into a single life. Long before the frail figure at Kensington Palace, Princess Margaret was the embodiment of post-war glamour, the woman who brought life back into a country still gray from rationing. It was the late 1940s, and Britain was rebuilding itself, clinging to its monarchy for a sense of stability. Yet, even within those gilded walls, something restless stirred. You see her as she was then, radiant, 17 years old, the second daughter of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. Her laughter filled Clarence House, her eyes a flash of blue fire. She adored music, parties, and the theater. She smoked from the age of 15, drank champagne before dinner, and made no secret of her taste for the glamorous and forbidden. And then, in the early years of her adulthood, came Peter Townsend. You can almost picture him now, a dashing Royal Air Force hero turned equerry. 16 years her senior, divorced, and utterly inappropriate in the eyes of church and crown. When their secret relationship became public in 1953, Britain trembled. A princess could not marry a divorced man, not under the laws that bound the monarchy to the Church of England. For the young Margaret, it was not law but betrayal that cut deepest. She had watched her sister ascend to the throne at just 25. Watched duty consume her life. Now that same institution turned on her, cold, unyielding. You can hear the echo of her voice from her later interviews, calm, almost detached. "I would like to be a simple countrywoman," she once said, "but I'm not allowed." That was the curse of her lineage, privilege without freedom. In 1955, after months of pressure from the government and the church, Margaret released a statement to the public. "I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. The announcement was written in the language of dignity, but the world could sense the heartbreak beneath it. As she stood before cameras, perfectly poised, her hands trembled only once, barely visible, but enough for those who were watching closely. What came next was not resignation but rebellion. Deprived of love, she sought control in indulgence. The 1960s roared, and she roared with them. She smoked up to 60 cigarettes a day, drank scotch before noon, and surrounded herself with artists, actors, and the aristocratic bohemians who filled the drawing rooms of London. You see her in Mystique, her private Caribbean paradise, sunburned, cigarette in hand, laughing too loudly, the sea wind tangling her hair. The island became her refuge, and her cage. She built Les Jolies Eaux, a villa of white stucco and turquoise shutters, where the air smelled of salt, rum, and scandal. Here, she entertained rock stars, actors, and politicians, a constellation of fame orbiting her discontent. Photographs from the time show her with Lord Snowdon, Anthony Armstrong Jones, the man she did marry, a photographer who saw both her beauty and her brittleness. Their wedding in 1960 was the first royal wedding broadcast on television. Watched by over 300 million people, the nation celebrated. The tabloids crowned her the glamorous princess. But glamour has a short half-life. Within a decade, the marriage collapsed under the weight of infidelity, jealousy, and Margaret's growing dependence on alcohol and sedatives. Snowdon's letters turned cruel, hers turned desperate. Friends described her as magnetic but volatile, charming one moment, cutting the next. She chain-smoked through dinners, laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, and slipped into melancholy between parties. By the late 1970s, she was the face of a monarchy trying to appear modern and failing. She was photographed in swimsuits, on yachts, with lovers half her age. The tabloids feasted on her excess, calling her the royal hellraiser. She didn't care, or pretended not to. But behind the bravado, her body began to revolt. Years of chain smoking led to chronic bronchitis. Heavy drinking strained her liver and heart. She suffered her first mild stroke in 1998 while at her holiday home in Mystique. The heat, once her comfort, now suffocated her. Witnesses said she fell into the scalding water of a bathtub, burning her feet badly. After that, she never fully recovered. You can imagine the sound of her walking stick tapping down the corridors of Kensington Palace. Each step slower, each breath shorter. The woman who once danced barefoot at parties now moved with pain etched into every gesture. In public, she hid it well. She still attended royal functions, her face painted in flawless masks, rouge to cover the pallor, pearls to disguise the trembling of her hands. But behind closed doors, nurses became her companions. The glamorous island nights had given way to sterile rooms and quiet humiliations. In 1999, another stroke left her partially paralyzed on the left side. Her speech slurred, her laughter came in broken fragments. She was terribly lonely. One attendant later said, "The television was always on. Cigarettes still burned in the ashtray. But she mostly sat in silence." By then, even her children, David and Sarah, visited less often, torn between affection and exhaustion. Friends from the old days had drifted away, or died. The world that had once revolved around her had quietly moved on. Still, she refused to yield. In the autumn of 2001, she attended a charity event at the London Palladium. Cameras captured her arrival, sunglasses at night, a cane in one hand, a faint smile on her lips. Her defiance had shrunk, but it had not died. When the final winter came, her body had already begun to surrender. Pneumonia took hold of her lungs. Her heart struggled to keep pace with the slow collapse of her organs. Nurses found her on the morning of February 9, 2002, breathing shallowly, her skin cool. She had suffered another stroke during the night. By 6:30 a.m., the room was still. Her hand, once so restless, fell limp. Cigarette smoke no longer filled the air. The rebellion was over. And yet, as you stand there, In that same room where she breathed her last, you realize something strange. The silence does not feel peaceful. It feels suspended, like the air before a storm. As though somewhere in the folds of the palace curtains, the echo of her laughter still lingers, daring, defiant, unwilling to vanish completely. Even in death, she refused to fade quietly. You can almost hear it, the faint rattle of her breath against the silence of her private quarters. A sound like damp paper being torn, fragile and irregular. In her final years, Princess Margaret lived as both a relic and a warning. The glittering symbol of excess whose body began collecting the debts her spirit refused to pay. After her first stroke in 1998, her doctors told her she would need to rest, to stop smoking, to drink less. She smiled politely, the same tight smile she had offered to bishops and prime ministers in her youth. And ignored them. She believed that control meant continuing, that stopping would be the real surrender. So, the cigarettes remained. The gin bottles lined her shelves, disguised as crystal decanters. Even as her left side weakened, she insisted on pouring her own drinks. The stroke left her face subtly asymmetrical. Photographs from those years show her attempting to maintain composure, her hair coiffed, her lips painted crimson, but the shadows under her eyes had deepened. Behind closed doors, the palace doctors reported tremors, fainting spells, confusion. Her once razor-sharp wit began to slip into forgetfulness. In Mystique, where she had once danced barefoot at parties, she now needed help just to walk across the veranda. The villa that had once smelled of salt, tobacco, and laughter now reeked faintly of medicine and mildew. The humid Caribbean air clung to her clothes. Her hands shook when she lifted a glass. Her loyal staff described her as diminished, but still proud. Then came the accident in 1999, the scalding bath. It was early morning, and she had tried to step into the tub unaided. Her weakened left side betrayed her. She fell, trapping her leg against the hot water tap. The burns were severe. She screamed until the housekeeper came running, finding her shaking uncontrollably, her skin blistered and red. The pain never fully left her. The nerve damage made walking agony. Even when her wounds healed, her gait became uneven, her back stooped. The glamorous silhouette that once graced magazine covers was replaced by a frail figure in orthopedic shoes, leaning on a cane. By 2000, she had withdrawn almost entirely from public life. The press, which had once followed her every scandal, now turned its gaze elsewhere, toward younger royals. Fresher drama. She appeared rarely, mostly at family occasions. Her presence was both pitied and feared, a living reminder of what happened when royal privilege collided with human weakness. At Christmas gatherings in Sandringham, she was often seen sitting apart, her hands trembling as she held her teacup. Courtiers whispered that her speech had grown slurred, her temper short. She lashed out at nurses, then apologized in tears. The strong-willed princess who once commanded rooms now struggled to command her own body. Her heart began to fail next. The years of heavy drinking had left it enlarged and weakened. Her liver, too, bore the marks of long abuse. She suffered from recurrent infections, digestive problems, and chronic insomnia. Her doctors described her condition as multi-system deterioration. It was not one disease that was killing her, it was the slow rebellion of every organ she had overworked. Margaret's appearance shocked those who had known her in her youth. The cheekbones that once caught the light of flashbulbs now jutted against pale, loose skin. Her hair, once lustrous and styled with regal precision, had thinned into uneven tufts. Her hands were mottled with bruises from IV lines and blood thinners. Yet she still insisted on her morning makeup routine: rouge, powder, pearls. "I mustn't frighten the staff," she joked once, the humor brittle but intact. In 2001, the deterioration accelerated. She had difficulty swallowing, often choking on food. Her eyesight blurred. She experienced more small strokes, silent ones, the kind that steal memory and clarity rather than motion. She became confused, sometimes mistaking visitors for long-dead friends. One evening, She reportedly asked for music. A recording of Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. As the melody played, she smiled faintly and said, "That was always my song." It was as though she had accepted the cruel irony that the very smoke which had defined her life was now consuming what remained of it. You can picture her room that winter, the curtains drawn tight, the air stale with the scent of stale cigarettes and perfumed talc. A nurse sits quietly by the door, reading. The princess dozes in her chair, her cane resting across her knees. Outside, the gardens of Kensington Palace are bare, the fountains frozen. Life continues beyond the walls. Indifferent. Then, in January 2002, she suffers another major stroke. This one leaves her nearly blind in one eye. Her speech barely intelligible. She's taken to King Edward VII's hospital, the same place where her father had once been treated for lung cancer before his death. The symmetry does not go unnoticed by the royal household. There, among sterile corridors and polite nurses, she drifts in and out of consciousness. Visitors are kept few. Her mother, the Queen Mother, then 101 years old, is told gently that her youngest daughter is failing. The Queen visits quietly, avoiding cameras. The sisters who had once been inseparable in childhood now share only silence, one ruled by restraint, the other by consequence. Margaret returns to Kensington Palace, but it is no longer home. Machines hum beside her bed. Her meals come pureed. Her hands, once adorned with diamonds, tremble too much to hold a cup. She watches old films, listens to the radio, and sometimes stares at the portrait of herself painted in her 20s, the rebel princess in full bloom. A cigarette between her fingers, her eyes defiant. Her body has become a battlefield. The right side still obeys her, the left side numb and useless. Each breath sounds heavier, wetter. She sleeps often, dreaming in fragments. Those who attended to her described her final days as quiet, but restless. She hated pity, even at the end. By February 8, 2002, her temperature had risen sharply. Pneumonia had set in. She complained of chest pain, gasping between words. The nurses adjusted her oxygen mask, changed her sheets, whispered instructions. The palace doctor was called. In the early hours of February 9th, she woke briefly. One nurse said she whispered something, perhaps a name, perhaps just air. Then came a small, involuntary sigh. Her hand slipped from the blanket. The machine's rhythm faltered, then stopped. The woman who had fought the monarchy, the tabloids, the church, and her own body was gone at 6:30 a.m. Outside, London carried on. Commuters boarded trains. The February wind rattled the palace gates. And behind the windows of apartment 1A, a stillness took root that would not lift for days. Her death was announced officially by Buckingham Palace later that morning. The Queen, with great sadness, has asked for it to be announced that her beloved sister, Princess Margaret, died peacefully in her sleep this morning. But those who had been there knew it was not peaceful. It was a surrender, slow, painful, inevitable. And as you stand again in that silent room, you sense that surrender still lingers in the air, invisible, but heavy, like the last breath she never truly released. You stand in the gray morning light of February 15, 2002, 6 days after her death. The bells of Windsor toll, deep and resonant, echoing over the frozen lawns of St. George's Chapel. A fine mist lingers in the air, clinging to black coats and gloved hands. You can taste the damp in your throat, the metallic chill of winter mixed with the faint sweetness of lilies. Princess Margaret's coffin arrives just after 10. It is small, draped in the royal standard, a spray of white roses laid across its polished oak surface. No gilded carriage, no crowds lining the streets like they once did for her father. This is a quieter affair, deliberate, restrained, almost private. The contrast is striking. For a woman whose life was lived in bright defiance, her farewell is hushed, ceremonial, and steeped in shadows. The Queen stands at the head of the aisle, her expression unreadable. The Queen Mother, frail but determined, sits nearby, wrapped in black wool. Her eyes are distant, as though the century of her life has folded into a single line of sorrow. Beside her sits Prince Charles, his head bowed. The pews hold only a few hundred, family, close friends, household staff, and those who had once circled her during the heady days of London's social whirl. No music from the swinging 60s. No jazz or piano. Only the solemn chords of Psalm chapter 121. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills. From whence cometh my help? The words rise and fall through the vaulted stone, each echo settling like dust on the ancient floor. You can feel it, the weight of centuries pressing down. Margaret had chosen this. She had made it clear she wanted no grand spectacle, no tabloid theater in death. But there was one detail that startled even those closest to her. She had asked to be cremated. No royal had done so since Princess Louise in 1939. And before that, the practice was nearly unthinkable. Royals were buried, entombed in marble and tradition. Margaret, as always, would not obey even in death. You can almost see the hesitation in the courtiers' eyes as they arranged it. The royal household is built on precedent, and this was none. But the Queen, bound by both love and duty, respected her sister's final wish. Margaret would be cremated, and her ashes placed beside their father in the King George VI Memorial Chapel. She would, at last, rest in the shadow of the man who had loved her most unconditionally. The service ends quietly. The choir's final hymn dissolves into silence, broken only by the soft creak of shoes on stone as mourners rise. Outside, a cold drizzle begins to fall. Umbrellas bloom across the courtyard like black flowers. The coffin is borne away towards Slough Crematorium, an ordinary building for an extraordinary woman. No cameras are allowed inside. Only a handful of attendants witness the final moment. You can imagine the sound, the hiss of the furnace door closing, the low mechanical hum, the faint crackle of heat rising. The rebellious princess, who once burned through life like a comet, now reduced to cinders within minutes. Later, when the ashes return to Windsor, the urn is small, understated, dark bronze. It is placed on a velvet cushion and carried into the private chapel, where her father's coffin rests beneath marble slabs. There, in the glow of candlelight, the Queen bows her head. The air smells of wax and old stone. You can almost hear the faint echo of footsteps from the past, her father's laughter, her sister's sharp voice, the ghost of a family that once felt invincible. The following weeks pass in subdued routine. The papers print retrospectives filled with old photographs, Margaret laughing at the ballet, stepping from a Rolls Royce in a cloud of cigarette smoke, swimming off Mystique in turquoise waters. Commentators call her tragic, flawed, ahead of her time. Few mention the loneliness that crept in at the end. The tabloids that had once feasted on her scandals now eulogize her beauty, her wit, her independence. Death, it seems, has a way of laundering reputation. At Kensington Palace, her apartment is left untouched for months. Staff members enter quietly to dust the furniture, water the plants. The walls remain hung with portraits, a young Margaret in tulle and diamonds, painted in the 1950s, gazing out as though she still expects to be adored. In her dressing room, half-empty perfume bottles line the vanity. Lipsticks, still capped, in shades of crimson she can no longer wear. A pair of silver ashtrays gleam faintly in the dim light. You can picture the silence of those rooms. No more piano notes drifting through the hall. No more laughter rising over the clink of glasses. Only the faint tick of the clock, a reminder that even palaces eventually go quiet. Her mother follows her only 7 weeks later. The Queen Mother dies in March 2002, aged 101. The press calls it a sorrowful symmetry. The two women, inseparable in life, now united in death. Their coffins rest side by side for a time in the chapel, before the Queen Mother's body is interred with her husband and daughter. For the Queen, the loss of both mother and sister in such short succession marks the end of an era. The private notes of palace aides record her grief as deep, but unspoken, Elizabeth had always been the embodiment of composure, the monarch who never faltered. But those who knew her say that for years afterward, she kept a photograph of Margaret in her sitting room, beside the one of their parents. Public memory of Margaret remains divided. To some, she is the reckless princess, the chain smoker who partied with rock stars, whose vanity and temper embarrassed the crown. To others, she is a tragic figure, a woman born into a cage of duty, punished for wanting what ordinary people took for granted: love, freedom, joy. Both are true. Historians would later note that Margaret's cremation subtly changed royal funerary tradition. Decades later, her nephew, King Charles III, would order that he too be cremated. Following her example, even in death, she left an imprint on the monarchy she once defied. When you visit the King George VI Memorial Chapel today, the air is cool and still. The marble glows faintly under the filtered light. On the floor, near her father's resting place, a simple inscription reads, Princess Margaret, 1930 to 2002. No title, no epitaph, no flourish, just the name, the dates, and the silence in between, a life that burned brightly, too briefly, and then turned to ash. You kneel there for a moment. The scent of flowers left by visitors mingles with the cold stone. In your mind, you can almost see her again, cigarette in hand, eyes narrowed in amusement, saying something daring just to see who would blush first. And then she's gone. A woman who once filled headlines now survives only in whispers, in grainy footage, in the faint scent of smoke that seems to linger in the royal halls long after her departure. You leave the chapel in silence. The doors close behind you with a soft thud, sealing in the echoes of a royal life that refused to behave. You walk again through the quiet corridors of Kensington Palace. It has been years since her passing, yet her presence lingers, not as a ghost, but as a vibration, faint and persistent, like perfume long soaked into the walls. The palace itself has changed. Exhibitions now open her rooms to the public. Visitors shuffle past her old bed, her grand piano, her silver cigarette cases displayed behind glass. They whisper, almost reverently, as if afraid to disturb what remains of her rebellion. But if you listen closely, beneath the hum of the tour guides and the camera shutters, you can almost hear her laughter, sharp, amused, a sound that once both charmed and unsettled. It's as though she's still watching, daring you to judge her. Princess Margaret's story has become one of contradictions. To some, she is the cautionary tale, a woman destroyed by privilege, addiction, and vanity. To others, she is a martyr of emotion, a royal who dared to want more than duty. History, like memory, has no mercy. It prefers its women simple, saints or sinners. Margaret was neither, she was both. As the decades pass, her legacy ripens into something more complicated, more human. Scholars point out that she was the first senior royal to publicly challenge the suffocating moralism of the post-war establishment. She questioned the rigidity of royal life long before Princess Diana, long before Meghan Markle. Her defiance made her unpopular, but it also made her real. You think of her life as a mirror, one that reflected the tension between the private and the public, between human desire and royal expectation. She was born into a system designed to control everything: who she could love, how she should speak, even what time she should wake. Yet within that golden cage, she fought to carve a self. Every cigarette, every glass of whiskey, every scandal was a declaration of ownership over her own existence. Her rebellion was not against her sister, nor even against the crown itself. It was against the idea that duty should erase identity. She wanted to live, fully, recklessly, beautifully, and perhaps that was her greatest sin. In her diaries, few, fragmented, heavily guarded by the royal archives, her handwriting remains meticulous, elegant, almost architectural. One entry from the 1960s reads simply, "I am not made to be good. I am made to be alive." The words carry both arrogance and ache. She understood herself with painful clarity. You imagine her now, seated at her dressing table, applying her lipstick with precision, The mirror reflects her face. The camera flashes. The headlines that will judge her tomorrow. She knows they will call her selfish. But she keeps painting her mouth red anyway. It's a small act of rebellion. Repeated daily. Against a world that demands repentance. Even in her decline, she held on to that performance. Visitors recalled that she greeted them from her wheelchair wearing diamonds, perfume, and a faint smirk. When one friend asked how she was feeling, she replied, "Still not dead, darling." It was gallows humor, but it was also pride. She refused to let death strip her of style. The monarchy has always thrived on image, ritualized composure, emotional restraint, the illusion of perfection. Margaret shattered that illusion. She laughed too loudly, desired too openly, suffered too visibly. Her body's collapse was not just physical but symbolic, a reminder that beneath the titles and crowns, mortality spares no one. In her later years, when public sympathy began to replace scandal, her image softened. She was no longer the royal hellraiser, but the tragic younger sister, the woman who sacrificed love for duty, who paid the price of defiance in solitude. Films, biographies, and television series reimagined her life, transforming her into a figure of melancholy glamour. Yet these retellings often miss the quiet truth. Margaret didn't want pity. She wanted agency. The royal archives hold one photograph seldom published, Margaret at age 9. Sitting beside her sister Elizabeth in matching dresses. Elizabeth looks serious, already composed. Margaret grins, eyes sparkling with mischief. That small difference, one smile, one shadow, would define the course of both their lives. One would reign, the other would rebel. And yet, in the end, they were bound not by contrast but by blood, by an invisible thread of affection and rivalry that neither could sever. After Margaret's death, the Queen reportedly said little in public, but palace aides later revealed that every February, she had flowers placed quietly in the chapel beside her sister's urn. No press release, no statement, just a gesture, silent, constant, loyal. You imagine those flowers, white roses, sometimes lilies, resting atop the marble. The air is cool, and the chapel light shifts through stained glass, tinting everything in soft blues and golds. Visitors pass by, unaware of the private act unfolding within that sacred space. The monarchy endures. The world moves on, but somewhere in that silence, sisterhood survives. Margaret's ashes rest only a few feet from where her father was buried. The man who had once called her, "my joy." The symmetry is perfect. A daughter who lived like a flame, now cradled in the quiet heart of Windsor. And yet, beyond the marble and ceremony, her legacy continues to smolder. The modern royal family, more candid, more expressive, more human, owes something to her rebellion. Her insistence on authenticity cracked open the facade that had long defined the Windsors. She never lived to see it change, but she helped make that change inevitable. Still, her story remains a warning as much as a triumph. Freedom without peace is another kind of prison. She escaped the constraints of her crown, only to fall captive to her own appetites. Her life was a pendulum swinging between pleasure and punishment, between glamour and decay. When you stand again before her portrait, the official one from 1958, painted in oil and shadow, you see her eyes fixed on something just beyond you. There is no regret in them, only challenge. The artist captured it perfectly, that unbroken defiance, that refusal to apologize for being fully herself. The tour moves on. The guide speaks of her musical talent, her role in promoting the arts, her contribution to charity. The visitors nod politely, unaware that the room still smells faintly of smoke and roses. You linger a moment longer, tracing the outline of her life in your mind, the glittering highs, the grim decline, the quiet ash at the end, and you realize that what makes her story so haunting is not the tragedy, but the truth it exposes, that even in palaces, the human heart remains fragile, restless, ungovernable. Outside, the evening falls over London. The palace lights flicker on, golden against the deepening blue. Somewhere, in the cold air, you think you catch a faint echo, a laugh, perhaps, or just the rustle of memory. It's hard to tell. But you leave with the sense that Margaret never truly left at all. The palace gardens are still at dusk. The air carries the faint scent of roses, not the lush bloom of summer, but the brittle perfume of petals beginning to decay. Somewhere beyond the gates, the hum of London continues, indifferent to the stories buried behind these walls. You walk past the iron railings, the marble statues, the windows still faintly lit, and it strikes you that no sound remains of her voice, only the echo of how she lived and how she died. History records Princess Margaret as many things: a beauty, a scandal, a disappointment, a modernizer, but beneath the labels, she was something rarer. A woman who dared to live at full volume in a world that demanded silence. She smoked, she drank, she loved, she hurt, she was punished for it, admired for it, and in the end, undone by it. Yet what lingers is not the ruin, but the rebellion. You picture her again, that famous photograph from 1956. She's standing on the balcony, cigarette poised between two fingers, eyes half-lidded, expression half-bored, half-daring. Behind her, London stretches in grayscale, a city still rebuilding itself after war. Before her, the flashbulbs burst like fireworks. That moment, frozen in silver nitrate, tells you everything. She belonged to the crown, but her spirit belonged to no one. Decades later, her ashes rest in the stillness of Windsor Chapel, but her story refuses to lie quiet. It hums in the walls of Kensington, in the notes of jazz records she once played, in the faint ghost of smoke that lingers no matter how often the rooms are aired. The rebellion that once scandalized a kingdom has become a kind of inheritance, proof that even those born into duty cannot be denied their humanity. You stop before her inscription. Princess Margaret, 1930 to 2002. The letters are simple, precise, without flourish. There is no mention of her titles, no praise, no apology, just two dates and the dash between them, the measure of a life. You realize that everything she was, the laughter, the pain, the glamour, the defiance, exists within that quiet line. Time, always merciless, has begun to polish her memory smooth. The gossip fades, the scandals soften into anecdotes. What remains is the shape of a life that could not be tamed, the price she paid for wanting freedom inside a gilded cage. Perhaps it was never rebellion for its own sake. Perhaps it was survival. The palace bells toll the hour. Their sound rolls through the courtyard. Solemn and distant, you look once more toward the chapel, where the last light of day fades through stained glass, gold. Then red, then gone. For all her excesses, Margaret's story is not a tragedy. It is a reminder. That power does not protect from loneliness. That beauty does not outlast breath. That rebellion, though costly, is sometimes the only way a soul can prove it existed. And somewhere, in that quiet between the final heartbeat and the silence that follows, she found what she had sought all along, a moment that belonged entirely to herself. The world moved on, the headlines changed, and history continued its relentless march. But if you listen carefully, in the hush of Windsor, or the soft tick of the clock in her empty room, you might still hear it. A single laugh, drifting through smoke and time, refusing to disappear. Because you are not a tourist in time. You are a witness,